All right, everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're thrilled you could join us for the Dredging in Virginia webinar presented by the Waterfront Law team. Before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping notes. If you could please make sure your cameras are on mute as well as your cell phones. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat function on the side. We've allotted for Q&A at the conclusion of our webinar. And lastly, we'll be recording today's webinar. At the conclusion, we will post the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides to our Waterfront Law Team website. Typically, we get that up a few days post-event, so look for that early next week. And now I would like to introduce you to our host, Jim Lang. Jim is a shareholder and Chief Operating Officer at the law firm of Pender and Coward. He focuses his practice on protecting Virginians who live, work, and play on the water. Jim established the Waterfront Law Team at Pender and Coward. He and the other three attorneys in this group routinely handle all aspects of riparian property rights law, maritime and admiralty law, and environmental law. Clients consistently turn to the Waterfront team when they need help in court, at the local wetlands boards, and with the VMRC. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Jim.
Good morning, everybody. So glad you're with us to talk about dredging in Virginia. Let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. The economic impact of dredging, which is very significant, but it's also important to the residential waterfront property owner. We'll touch on the permit process, environmental requirements, costs, and we have time for questions at the end. So an overview of dredging, this is a process to remove sediments from the bottom of water bodies. And the reason that you need to do it is to provide the depth necessary to ensure the safe passage of vessels. And then it's also done on occasion for an environmental reason, that is to remove contaminated sediment. There was a big project about 4 years ago in Portsmouth to remove creosote contaminated sediment from the southern branch of the Elizabeth River and clean that river up. Dredging has 3 steps: extraction, transport, and disposal. And now to touch on the economic impact, nationwide, $1.6 trillion of cargo passing through our ports in 2017. And here locally in Virginia, it means $39 billion to our gross state product that these large vessels can get in and out of the Port of Virginia. And then our local watermen need navigable channels as well, and that's a $184 million industry, all of it with significant jobs attached to those numbers. And if you just think about it, these large ships bringing goods into our country, it doesn't do anybody any good if these ships can make the 10,000-mile journey from China over to Virginia and then can't make the last 3 or 4 or 5 miles to get into our port. If they're blocked out of our port because the water's too shallow, that means we're not going to have products on our shelves, and we're not going to have products at our Amazon fulfillment centers. So dredging is vital to the economy at all levels. And it's interesting to watch on the East Coast how the different ports compete with one another to get a piece of this $1.6 trillion that's available nationally in our economy. And the way they're competing is with channel depth. In New York, our biggest port, the highest volume, you can see it's 7.5 million 20-foot equivalent units in 2020. That's a 20-foot long container. By far the greatest volume goes through New York, but they're limited right now to a 50-foot channel depth. And they've also have a problem with some bridges overhead that they're going to have to raise if they're going to increase their passage in and out. And then in the other 3 ports on the East Coast, the other 3 top producing ports on the East Coast, Savannah, Norfolk, and Charleston, in each of those ports, there are dredging projects underway to deepen their channels. And they're doing this because of the ultra-large container ships that are now moving cargo worldwide. So in Savannah, they're trying to get down to 47 feet, but in Virginia, we're already at 50 feet. And there's a big dredging project underway right now that's going to take us to 55 feet and widen our channels. Charleston is at 45 feet. and trying to move to 52. They have a project underway right now to move to 52. So there's a ton of dredging going on at the major ports on the East Coast. Again, trying to make sure that those state economies are getting a piece of this $1.6 trillion business. But let's not lose sight of the residential waterfront property owner. Their dredging is important to them also. What I've shown you here is an excerpt off of a NOAA navigational chart. And I want you to focus on Gwin Island, which is to the right. And just imagine that you're somebody who lives very close to that capital G in the word Gwin, and you want to make a day sail down to Norfolk. Well, what you'd like to do is come out of your cove, hit Milford Haven, and you can see where the words Milford Haven move from sort of the top left down to the bottom right. You'd like to follow those words, Milford Haven, come out into the Chesapeake Bay, sail past the mouth of the York River, sail past the James and into Hampton Roads. But you can't do that because that passage where you see the words haven of Milford Haven is called the hole in the wall. And the hole in the wall silts in. And right now it's not really passable unless you really have a lot of experience in that waterway. And so as a result of the hole in the wall not having been dredged recently, instead of taking the route I just described to you, instead you're going to start where that capital G is. You're going to come out of your waterway, and instead of turning left and going towards the hole in the wall, you're going to turn right. And you're going to cross under the Gwin Island Bridge. You can see the line connecting Gwin Island to the mainland. And then you're going to come out into Hills Bay, and then you're going to circumnavigate all of Gwin Island and then get out into the bay and continue your journey. It's going to add about 3 hours. Dredging, though, would open up hole in the wall and make that trip a whole lot easier. We also know that the residential property owner who has deep water access is going to have a higher property value. And when you look at how much extra waterfront property owners pay to live on the water as compared to the house across the street that's not on the water, deep water will maximize their benefit of that premium. So dredging is very important to the residential waterfront property owner as well. There's a major neighborhood dredging project underway right now in Virginia Beach, and there's other municipalities that are considering a similar program. Types of dredging, just to touch on this very lightly, mechanical and hydraulic. And there's different types of mechanical, clamshell and backhoe, different types of hydraulic, cutter suction and hopper dredgers. And mechanical is used generally for the first time that you're dredging a water body, because it'll take care of those heavy gravels, where hydraulic dredging is very good for maintenance dredging after you've had your initial dredge and now you're coming back in to clean up the silt and the fine sands that have washed into the dredge cut. Hydraulic dredgers are really good for taking care of maintenance dredging. I've got an example here for you of a clamshell dredger. This is mechanical dredging. It suited for heavier gravels, and these mechanical dredgers, the clamshell dredger and the backhoe dredger, these are typically used for the initial dredge cut in a water body where you're dealing with those heavier gravels. So you just saw the extraction, then here's transport, and now disposal. So that's your clamshell dredger. Here's your backhoe dredger. Oftentimes this is nothing more than a barge with a backhoe on it. The backhoe dredger you're seeing in this image is a little more elaborate. It's a spud barge with a permanently mounted backhoe. But again, the same concept. It's mechanical. That scoop's going to go down in the water. It's going to grab a bucket full of sediment and bring it up for transport and ultimately disposal. Turning now to hydraulic dredgers. Here's a cutter suction dredger. And this is the first of two photos. I'm going to show you the back side of the ship, and then I'm going to show you the front side in action. But on the back side, it's kind of like a Cuisinart with some cutting blades. Those rotate and they dislodge the sediment. And in the middle of the cutting blades is a pipe that is sucking the water, vacuuming up what is getting dislodged by the cutter blades and sucking it up through the ship, and then out it comes through the front side. So that's your cutter suction dredger. And then for your hopper dredger, this one again is hydraulic dredging. So it's going to deal with those finer sediments that come in after you've initially dredged a channel. It works kind of like a vacuum cleaner, just pulls along the bottom, sucks up those fine sediments, and then sucks it up into the ship and into the cargo area and fills up, and that's your hopper dredger. You probably saw hopper dredgers in action off of Virginia Beach during beach nourishment a couple of years ago. And I believe instead of sending it into a cargo bay, there was long pipes that sent it right up onto the shore of Virginia Beach to widen out the Virginia Beach resort area shoreline. Turning now to your environmental requirements for dredging. Pretty long list. I've broken it into federal and state. We'll touch on the federal first. You're going to need a Clean Water Act permit for your dredging. It's under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which regulates fill activities. And your primary permitting authority is going to be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Hopefully your project will qualify for a general permit as opposed to an individual permit. General permits are those that describe the eligibility criteria that your project has to meet. And if your project can meet those eligibility criteria, then you submit a pre-construction notification to the Army Corps of Engineers. They confirm that your project fits within those guidelines, and then they give you coverage under the general permit. If, however, your project doesn't meet those eligibility criteria, then you're going to need an individual permit. And I can tell you that general permits are issued in a more streamlined fashion and cost a lot less. But if you can't fit your project into that pigeonhole that'll get you a general permit and you need an individual permit, there's going to be more engineering and analysis, and you're going to get a tailor-made 404 permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for your dredging project. And then the state of Virginia is going to have some oversight, and that's the second big bullet under the Clean Water Act, through the water quality certification that's required under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And what that section requires is if a federal agency is going to issue a permit for something that's going to impact water quality in the state of Virginia, the state of Virginia ought to be able to exercise some oversight over whether that permit is going to be suitable given the water quality goals in the state of Virginia. So there's going to be a water quality certification involved. Your next big federal environmental act is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And anytime that you need a federal permit, like your U.S. Army Corps of Engineer 404 fill permit for your dredging project, that's going to trigger an obligation on the part of the federal agency to comply with the requirements of NEPA. If it is a major federal action that has significant effects on the human environment, then the federal agency will be required to prepare an environmental impact statement. Very involved, several-year process, public hearings. But thankfully, most projects don't cross that threshold, and they can be handled either with an environmental assessment, much more streamlined, or better yet, a categorical exclusion, which is extremely streamlined. Your next major federal statute that's going to apply here is the Endangered Species Act. If you have various types of turtles or various types of manatees or even Atlantic sturgeon in your project area, then you're going to have some requirements to conduct your dredging in a way that doesn't interfere with those animals' feeding patterns, those animals' reproduction patterns. And you're going to have to deal with those, modify your project to work around those kinds of things so you're not interfering with those animals. Marine Mammal Protection Act is another one here. You're talking dolphins, whales, manatees, no matter whether they are endangered or not. And again, if those animals are going to be present in your project area, you're going to have to, you'll have accommodations that are required to avoid harassment or otherwise interfering with those animals in the way that would constitute a take. There's essential fish habitat under another federal statute. You've got the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. The Marine Protection Resource and Sanctuaries Act, that's the statute that governs the ocean disposal sites, of which we have 2 offshore Virginia and the Atlantic Ocean, and the Coastal Zone Management Act, which says that Virginia has a coastal zone management plan, and you may need a coastal consistency determination from Virginia that says that the way you're going to conduct your dredging project doesn't undermine or hinder Virginia's coastal zone management plan. So that's a run through of your federal environmental requirements. Virginia at the state level, the state water control law will come into play, especially if your dredging project is going to impact wetlands. And I've given you the code citation there. And then after you've extracted your spoils, if you're going to take them to a location for them to be dewatered, which is common, that water flowing off of the spoils, that effluent, if you will, could trigger the need for a VPDES permit, a Virginia Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. I've given you the Virginia Code citation for that. Another environmental requirement is at the VMRC, that you're going to be dredging on lands that are owned by the Commonwealth of Virginia. So just like before somebody could come into your front yard of your home and dig a hole, they would have to get your permission. Similarly, the Virginia owning these submerged lands, if you're going to come dig a trench in their submerged lands, you need to get their permission. And that's overseen by the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and their statutory authority is in Title 28.2 of the code, and I've given you the citations there. And if the spoils that you're extracting during your dredging project are suitable for beach nourishment, there's a code provision that requires a priority to the beaches in the Commonwealth, as opposed to sending that good quality sand down to North Carolina to replenish their beaches. And you may have the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act come into play, though most often I would expect that wouldn't be a factor, because I wouldn't think that your dredging activities would implicate using areas within the resource protection area along the Chesapeake Bay. Permit process. Your project's going to have to support a water dependent activity. Now, 99% of dredging projects, that's easy. For example, the neighborhood dredging project that's underway in the city of Virginia Beach right now obviously supports a water dependent activity, because they're dredging to create deep water so people can navigate their recreational boats from their dock out into the river. And the dredging project underway in the Norfolk Harbor right now obviously supports a water dependent activity. It's the movement of cargo across the oceans that cover 70% of our globe and support a major part of our economy. But that is a threshold issue. Your project has to be tied to a water dependent activity. And you're going to kick off your permit process by submitting a joint permit application, a JPA, to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. And the VMRC is going to be the clearinghouse. They are going to coordinate the review with all the state agencies that have a say in your project. And they're also going to get the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers involved. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will then coordinate review among their sister federal agencies. But the VMRC is going to be your clearinghouse. If it's a larger sort of complicated project, you probably don't want to fill out your JPA and just mail it in. You probably ought to go sit down with the VMRC and have a pre-application meeting. And if it's a particularly large and complicated project, that might not be your only pre-application meeting, but doing those things will make your process go a lot better after you submit your JPA. factors that could lengthen your timeline or make your project more complicated or even harder to approve. You're probably not going to get to dredge through subaquatic vegetation. There's been a lot of work to expand SAV beds in the Chesapeake Bay, and there's not going to be much of an appetite for dredging through one of those. If there are shellfish grounds or public grounds in the area, you're not going to be able to dredge certainly through the public grounds and maybe not through the shellfish grounds. Special aquatic areas are sensitive, and dredging through there is not favored. We talked earlier about if you've got threatened or endangered species in the vicinity, that can complicate your project. Won't stop it, but can complicate it. And marine mammals the same way. Disposal sites in Hampton Roads. This is a sampling. I mentioned the ocean disposal sites earlier. You've got the Dam Neck Ocean Disposal Site about 5 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach out in the Atlantic Ocean. And then the Norfolk Ocean Disposal Site that's about 15 miles out and a little farther north. Both of these are run by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers under the MPRSA statute I mentioned a couple of slides back. Beneficial use is always encouraged, and the Craney Island dredged material management area is one of those locations, along with the Craney Island Eastward Expansion site. But those two sites are only available for dredge spoils that are connected to the Norfolk Harbor. They're not available for other projects. And then, of course, beach nourishment is a wonderful beneficial use. And then you've got upland disposal options, which I've listed there for you. And again, these are the ones that are generally available for projects in Hampton Roads. Cost examples, I've just put 2 of them up here for you, sort of each end of the spectrum. One is the $292 million project to deepen and widen the Norfolk Harbor to accommodate these ultra large container ships. And then at the other end of the spectrum, a small residential project that's going to run about $60,000. And I've given you some cost figures in there. And then the factors that will drive cost is, how much material do you need to remove? Where's the project located? And in what condition is the spoils that you're going to remove? And then I've also broken out the different elements of the cost of your project. So I hope that's helpful to you. I'm not going to walk through every word on the slide. We'll put this up on the website after the seminar is over, and you can look at it at your leisure. Additional resources for you. These are blog articles on my website. If you go to my website, top right corner, you'll find a search window. You type in the word dredging, and every article that deals with dredging will come up. These are 3 that are probably would be most interesting to you. And with that, I'd be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Jim. This concludes the live portion of our webinar. We'll now open it up, as Jim said, to Q&A. And for those who might be joining at a later date, please be sure to visit our website and stay current on our upcoming webinars.